Healthcare is a human right.
That's a great way to start the podcast. Okay, episode 232. We're going to be talking about the Democratic debates. We're going to be talking a lot about Bernie Sanders and his spending plans, a little bit about healthcare, and some fracking on this episode of the In the Tank podcast. All right, gentlemen, this is episode 232. As always, I'm your host, Donald Kendal, joined by a couple of folks. We have Justin Haskins, editorial director here at the Heartland Institute. Justin, how are you, good sir?
I'm doing very well, Donald. Thank you for asking. I just came from the TV studio.
Oh, snap.
Yeah, I know. So you guys should, you should be really honored. You know, I just came from a TV studio and did like a legit show.
You know what to do. Thank you. All right.
Yeah, Justin, I heard, ladies and gentlemen, got a job as a fluffer in...
Stop. All right. Is Isaac Orr, policy fellow at the Center of the American Experiment. Send all your emails to him, not me. Isaac, how are you doing, good sir?
I am great, Donald.
Awesome. And also knowing when to pull the plug on Justin, we have in the dark corner of the office our producer extraordinaire, Andy Singer.
Someone in that control room is out of control.
That's true. That is true. All right, folks. First off, we are going to talk about the debate. But unlike a lot of sequels, or just like a lot of sequels, it didn't really live up to the last one. So we're not going to spend too much time on it, but I thought there were some interesting bits, and we'll use that as a leaping off point to talk a lot about Bernie Sanders in this episode. But first, Isaac's like, I need you guys to play this clip so I could talk about it. So a little bit about coronavirus. Which
actually inaccurate, but I'll live with it.
It's got a little bit of play. The candidates seem to think that it was Trump's fault somehow. So, yeah, we're going to talk about that a little bit. But just before we play this clip, get that ready, Mr. Producer. Last time we talked about it, you guys both were saying, like, I'm not worried about it at all. Put you guys basically on a 0 out of 1 to 10. Currently, it's still kind of making its way through whatever and it's in the news. Have you elevated your concern level? Let's start with you, Justin.
My concern level has gone from somewhere around 1 to somewhere about 1.5.
Wow.
Out of 100.
Out of 100. Okay. Well,
yeah. So
Isaac,
no, not concerned.
You were a 0 before. Are you? Where are you now?
1.5. I'll just steal Justin's answer. It's like,
yeah.
Out of 10.
When Justin's right, and Justin's frequently right.
Oh my God, that's the nicest thing he's ever said to me.
All right,
or about me. It's amazing.
Our president of the United States had like a press conference about the coronavirus, and so we have a clip of that Isaac is just dying for us to watch. So go ahead and play that.
Any of their behaviors?
No, I think you have to always, I do it a lot anyway, as you probably heard. Wash your hands, stay clean. You don't have to necessarily grab every handrail unless you have to. You do certain things that you do when you have the flu. I mean, view this the same as the flu. When somebody sneezes, I try and bail out as much as possible with the sneezing. I had a man come up to me a week ago. I hadn't seen him in a long time, and I said, how you doing? He said, fine. He hugs me, kisses. I said, are you well? He says, no. He said, I have the worst fever and the worst flu. And he's hugging and kissing me. So I said, excuse me. I went there, I started washing my hands. So you have to do that. This is, I really think, doctor, you want to treat this like you treat the flu, right? And, it's going to be.
So I think the CNN takeaway from that is Trump is anti-handrail and that he's for bailouts. So Isaac, why? Boom. So yeah, what's your thought about why did you want us to watch that so much?
Because I think it's awesome. Like, it was funny, but it also put this in context. So, Ebola is a terrible disease and it killed thousands of people over in Africa, but nobody in the United States who got it died. Right. I think that somebody's made the joke that the Kardashians have been married more times than people have died of Ebola in the United States. And this, every time there's the swine flu or SARS, like, the media blows everything out of proportion and makes it sound like it's going to be awful for everybody. But, this actually gave, like the flu's nothing to joke about. People die from it every single year, but it's also not something that is so insurmountable or deadly that it's going to be like a huge pandemic.
Sure. Yeah. All right. Well, that's all the coronavirus news that we'll have for today. So we'll reassess after another week. Maybe we'll get some updates here, gentlemen.
Moral of the story is Jim Lakely's wrong.
For the time being, yeah. Let's spike the football.
We need the alarms up to 11. That's my Jim Lakely impression.
Invest in iron bars for people's floors.
That's right. And now I'm going to vape out of the hole in my neck.
Okay. All right. We're gonna watch this episode. All right. So the debate happened. This is debate number 10. I know Justin watched it. Isaac, you did not. Like I said, it's a sequel. The last one was fantastic. This one, not so much. But I've got a couple of a piece here, I guess. This is from Reason Foundation, titled "The South Carolina Debate Democratic Primary Descends into Chaos." Says, what did we just watch? Last night's Democratic presidential debate, the 10th in the season so far, went awry in a spectacular way, as long as you weren't rooting for any particular candidate to look good. So it goes through some of the highlights. Bloomberg was seemingly the king of statements that were so jaw-droppingly tone deaf. Vice President Joe Biden had no shortage of awkward interjections and couldn't stop grumbling impolitely at the moderators for not allowing him to have his fair share of the time. Amy Klobuchar seemingly just wanted everyone to be normal. And Bernie Sanders was accused multiple times of being aided by the Russians. So, again, this isn't about policy. This is a political reality show. Justin, since you did watch it, would you expect anything less?
No, of course not. And especially not at this point in the race. Let's be honest. We all know that there's basically very little difference between these candidates on most issues. There are certain issues where they are a little different. Do you support a public option, or do you support a single payer system that gets rid of all private health insurance? That would be a sizable difference between them. There are some other things, but for the most part, these candidates are very similar, and even their differences are very well known among the Democratic Party voters. So really, how are they going to distinguish themselves from the pack at this point in the race? The only way to do that is to basically just attack one another and try to ruin each other in that way. And hopefully your voters find you likable or funny, or the other person terrible, or whatever it is. And at that point, that's the only way that you can really differentiate yourself. And that's what you're seeing in this.
Well, let me ask you this.
Last one.
So the biggest argument against Bernie Sanders, the biggest attack line, and I think pretty much everybody had this to say about him, was that if he becomes our nominee, he's not beating Trump. And I think Bloomberg said, like, that's why the Russians are helping you, is because they know that you'll lose to Trump or whatever. So do you buy that? Do you think that there's no chance of Bernie being able to beat Trump?
Well, no chances. I don't. After Donald Trump winning in 2016, there's no such thing as no chance of anyone being able to. If you're one of two people that's being considered for president of the United States, then you can win.
I distinctly remember Justin Haskins saying that Donald J. Trump had no chance.
What?
Actually, I predicted that he would win.
That's true.
I have it in writing.
Justin's wrong.
No, we had a poll. We tried to predict what the map was going to look like, the Electoral College map, and I think Justin won. I came in second.
I did. Now
that predicted him to win.
Now, Isaac is probably remembering he's thinking probably in the primaries or something, because there was a time when I thought he couldn't win. And then as things went along, I believed he could win. By the time we got to the end of it, I was convinced he was probably going to win. I thought it was maybe too good to be true, but I did think it was possible that he could win. I think it's possible that Bernie Sanders could win. I don't think it's likely, but I think it's possible. And I think it's especially possible if the economy crashes. I mean, at this point, if you're the Democratic Party, that's what you're rooting for. You're rooting for the economy to crash, because if it does, then I think any of them could probably beat Donald
bets
Trump.
are off.
That, yeah, all bets are off. And so from that perspective, yeah, he could win. If that doesn't happen, probably not. I mean, it just depends.
Do you still think that he's going to drop out and not run for a second term? Because I remember you were all about that.
I was super into that idea for a while.
So what's your take now? Do you still
obviously
think that was a good call?
With it. Well, I think if he had continued, if the Russian collusion thing had gone south, and it didn't, for him, it actually got better because it just got more and more ridiculous for the other side. I think that was a very real possibility, but it just, the left could have easily destroyed Donald Trump and won this election. All they had to do was be reasonable, moderate people. That's it. Moderate Democrats. If they had found moderate Democrats, put them front and center 2 years ago and made the party, we're the party of common sense, working class guys, that's who we are. And they had gone that route, Donald Trump would be toast because a lot of people don't like his personality. And so I think he would have been toast no matter what. However, they didn't do that. Instead, they found the most unlikable people on the face of the earth, the least credible people in some cases, a bunch of old white people who nobody wants in the Democratic Party or outside of the Democratic Party, really, as far as I can tell. Nobody really thinks these candidates are great, but that's who they ended up rolling with. And as a result of that, I don't see at this point, it looks very likely that Trump will probably win the next election, barring some economic catastrophe or barring something else that we just can't predict at this point in time. But I really think that's really the only way. It would be an economic catastrophe. At this point, I think that's the situation.
So I only had a couple of real takeaways from this debate. And again, it wasn't even close to as entertaining as the last time. They all pounced on Bernie early, so that was pretty fun, but that was pretty short-lived. One thing was the audience was totally stacked for Bloomberg, and it was totally stacked against Bernie.
Biden too. Biden had a lot of people in the audience as well.
I would agree with that. Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen Bernie booed as much as he on Tuesday. That was extraordinary.
Maybe I'll have to watch some clips.
Yeah. At one point he says, Bloomberg, you've got a lot of, a big fan base or something like that, but they're all billionaires. And then the boos just rained down on Bernie. It was pretty hilarious. And he did his what's going on look, which was hilarious.
Yep.
Best moment in the entire debate. So last time it was Klobuchar looking down at her notes to remember the name that she forgot, which was hilarious.
Right.
This time, Bloomberg hilariously suggested that he won the last debate so much that he was surprised that any of the other candidates showed up to this current debate.
It was what made it so great was not that he said it. It was the way that he said it. It was so ham-fisted into the conversation. It was he was asked a question about some problem facing America or whatever, and then he decided to stop that and instead to say, I just want to take a moment to say I'm surprised any of you showed up because of how badly I beat you all last week. Everybody looks at him and is like, what?
Right.
Because for those of you who didn't see the first debate that Bloomberg was in, it may have been the worst debate performance of this election cycle, easily. Maybe the worst debate performance in the past 30 years. It was that bad. It was so bad.
Yeah, that was just so funny. I was like, is that part of his stand-up routine? That was hysterical. Favorite moment of the whole thing. Isaac, coming to you. One thing that I also noticed, because I watched the entire debate, they did not have any climate change questions. Not one. Tom Steyer was on stage. He brought it up once or twice. Yep. Maybe some other candidate kind of brought up the idea of green technology or something like that. But there was no climate change questions. What does that say to you?
That they accurately recognize that nobody thinks it's important.
Yeah.
It's nobody's top issue, right? It's not nobody's top issue, but it's not the top issue for most voters. So, but also, what are they going to do? Out compete each other to say, no, I want to pass the Green New Deal. And that's why, AOC was on the floor of Congress saying, oh, well, they didn't have one question about the climate crisis, so I'm going to read the whole Green New Deal to my Republican colleagues. So I don't know. It's not a winning strategy to talk about how much you're going to increase people's cost of living.
Yeah, I guess so. It was just kind of strange to me, especially considering that Tom Steyer, which I believe that's like his whole point of running, is to bring more attention to this subject.
Yeah.
And they just didn't bring it up. So I thought that was very interesting.
What do you think, Justin?
Yeah, I agree with what Isaac said. I just think I wonder too if the fact that it was in South Carolina, if that had something to do with it, sort of like, especially in South Carolina, nobody cares,
Right.
like maybe in California or something, people would
I
care about this
for sure.
Yeah, I could see that being a consideration as well. Because they talked a lot about guns. And they talked about the mass shootings that happened in South Carolina. They used that as kind of like a way to get a segue into those topics. And they did that twice, I think. So for them to not mention climate change, maybe it has something to do with the fact that it's, in South Carolina, they're probably on average a little bit more moderate Democrats than you have in, say, California or New York or something. I bet if this was a California debate, it would be, front and center.
Yep.
Yeah, I have one other kind of main takeaway, but I want to do a little segue here into Bernie Sanders was kind of grilled on his seemingly supporting certain aspects of the Castro regime in Cuba. And instead of trying to back away, which we know that he doesn't ever do when it comes to endorsing socialist governments throughout history, he basically insisted that no, there were some good facets of the Castro regime. So I have here a article from Human Progress, which is a project of Cato, that says Sanders is wrong on Cuban education and healthcare. So it goes through, and the reason that this all started like 40 years ago, but it got brought up recently in a 60 Minutes interview where Bernie Sanders applauded Cuba's education and healthcare systems. So but this article goes on to say that potential Sanders supporters should know that Cuba's literacy rate and healthcare systems are nothing to lionize. According to Sanders, let me do my Bernie Sanders. When Fidel Castro came into office, you know what he did? He had a massive literacy program. Is that a bad thing? So this goes on to say that Sanders is surely old enough to know that all communist dictatorships throughout history have ensured that their people were literate, in part so that the people might take in the disinformation printed by government propaganda ministries. So, I mean, that's one reason for why.
How can you read Pravda if you can't read?
Yeah, exactly.
Pravda, the audiobook.
Furthermore, a look at the data reveals that all of the progress regarding literacy that happened under communism in Cuba would almost certainly have happened under different political and economic systems. And it kind of compares some of the countries kind of in the region that weren't under the Castro regime, and showed that, for example, literacy rose even more in Paraguay than it did in Cuba. And there's some other examples of that. It shows different education advancements too, and how they compare to Cuba and how Cuba lagged underneath that. According to Cuba's official data, let's see. So then it starts talking about life expectancy and the healthcare results, because this is one of the things that Bernie Sanders will bring up, that lifespans have grown like 25% under communism. But it shows that other countries in the same region have improved even more, including Mexico, that's improved by 35% to Cuba's 25%, the Dominican Republic at 43% improvement, and Haiti, 51%.
Whoa, if you're getting beat by Haiti.
That's a good point, Isaac. That's ironclad.
So then it goes on to say that Castro committed numerous crimes against humanity, enslaved thousands of Cubans in forced labor camps for being attracted to members of the same sex, harboring counter-revolutionary thoughts, practicing minority religions, or simply looking unkempt like a hippie. So,
my gosh.
So, Andy,
but he taught a lot of kids how to read. So you left that off the list. You have to list it all. Right,
yeah.
To be fair, he taught kids how to read, so add that to the list.
It says that the slave labor of those Castro called social deviants provided an important source of income for the young communist regime, and any accomplishments of the regime must be viewed with that system of forced labor in mind. So also in recent research that Justin and I have done, Cuba has one of the worst records when it comes to like media suppression in the world, and that's up till today. And there's stories of political dissidents disappearing when they say certain bad things about the government. So like there's this this all reminded me of like there's this YouTube personality that I follow that does like movie reviews, and they were basically like one of their points that they were trying to make was like if you were to point out like the good things of a movie, that doesn't necessarily make the movie as a whole good. And the analogy that he came up with, this is a little crude, but the analogy that he came up with is like, you know, I could point to all of the good things about cancer and it doesn't make cancer good. Hey, you're going to lose some weight. Hey, you're going to save some money on food. Like that doesn't mean having cancer is good. Like it's just kind of remarkable that Bernie Sanders, front runner candidate for the presidential nominee, is endorsing certain aspects of the Castro regime. But Justin, I know that this doesn't shock you.
No. And I mean, if you go and you look at Bernie Sanders, you look at his record going back for many, many decades now, going back 40, 50 years, he has been embracing and endorsing socialist and communist regimes, including mass murderers, for a very, very long time. He was talking about in 1980, for example, he endorsed the Socialist Workers' Party presidential candidate. The Socialist Workers' Party is a communist party. Okay, it's a communist, essentially a Trotskyite organization. They're a communist globalist party, and he supported their presidential candidate. And in a press release that he issued in 1980 for explaining why he supported this candidate. And he didn't just support it; he was also an elector for them. He agreed to be an elector for them. One of the reasons he gave for supporting them was their support for the quote continued Cuban revolution. So this was in 1980 when people were desperate to get out of Cuba. Fidel Castro was ruling with an iron fist. He went to Nicaragua in the 1980s with while the Sandinistas, a radical Marxist group that was fighting a proxy war against the United States at the time. He went there and he supported the Sandinistas. He met with the president of Nicaragua at the time. He endorsed a book of speeches by Sandinistan writers in 1985, I believe is when he endorsed it. That's when the book came out anyway. He has a long track record of doing this sort of thing. So is it surprising? No, it's not surprising. This is who he is. What's surprising is that people aren't there. And I don't even really blame regular people for not knowing this stuff. I blame the media. As bad as the media is, as bad as as biased as the media is, you would think at least at this point in time, like what you would think there would be a threshold and that this would sort of be it, where they would be, concerned that this guy could become president of the United States. And yet they don't seem very concerned about it at all. I mean, certain people in the Democratic Party, certain people on the left are concerned. But look at what happened with Chris Matthews. When Chris Matthews said very recently that he was, this was a terrible, terrible thing that happened, that Bernie Sanders being the nominee would be a disaster. When he said that, he was crucified for saying that. And so I just think that the media is complicit in all of this. They're not telling people the truth. They're acting like Bernie Sanders is just he's a nice old, a cranky old lovable guy, right? Old guy who is a socialist, but socialism just means he wants what's in Denmark and Norway and Sweden, and that's it. And he's actually this fantastic guy, and there's really nothing to worry about here. And yeah, he says these crazy things. That was a long time ago. Don't even pay attention to that. And that's kind of it. I mean, can you imagine? I mean, Glenn Beck made this point when I went and did an interview with him recently, and he said, can you imagine if you had a Republican candidate or just any candidate for either party who came out and said something like, I don't like that the Nazis did the Holocaust, but what a highway system. What a great highway system we had, right. Like we should support the Nazis. I mean, I don't support the Holocaust, but I support the highway system. Right. Like nobody would tolerate that. Everyone would say, whoa. You couldn't find a better example. You had to go to the Nazis.
Yeah, Eisenhower also built an interstate system.
Yeah, right. Well, and lots of people have built literacy programs. Do we need to go to Cuba to find a working literacy program? The truth is he's a communist. That's what he is. He's a communist, and nobody wants to admit it. because the truth is so bizarre and horrifying. No one wants to admit it on that side, but that's just the reality of the situation. That the dude is a communist.
All right, so Isaac, Justin, and I, we're like totally surrounded by this socialism stuff with our Stopping Socialism project. Follow us on Facebook. So I want your viewpoint on this. Are we blowing this out of proportion, or is Bernie Sanders the crazy radical that we believe he is?
I do think it's interesting that your perception of the way the media treats him is you think it's like not negative, but I've been seeing a lot of people in just like my Facebook feed, and because that's where everybody gets their news nowadays, talking about how he's being unfairly treated by the corporate media. Like CNN is running some stories that are critical of Bernie. So I think that what has happened is that CNN has prepared the progressive left, if that's what you want to call it, or just Democratic voters, for a candidate that espouses all of the things that Bernie talks about. But now that they understand like what that looks like in a candidate, they're like, oh no.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting point there. And Justin, maybe you could respond to that because, on one hand, yeah, I do think that the media is, taking their whacks at Bernie Sanders.
I think they're trying to sandbag him now. Like, I think that they feel like this train is getting out of control. So they're trying to like get somebody else at the helm of it. But I don't know if they can. I feel that this is similar to like what happened with our Lord and Savior, Donald Trump. During 2016.
Well, yeah. So I don't know. There seems to be two conflicting things there, Justin. What's your point on that?
I think the difference. I don't disagree with Isaac that there are a lot of people in the press that are worried that he might actually win. I don't know that the whole press establishment wants Bernie to be the president of the United States necessarily, or be the nominee, because I think they're worried he might lose.
Yeah.
But what they did was they normalized him up to this point by not treating him like he was a total communist radical that he actually is, right?
Yep.
And so that to me is he should have been weeded out a long time ago. If you had a neo-Nazi, right, who was openly neo-Nazi and been neo-Nazi for years and years, they would never tolerate that. They would drive that person out of the public square way before they ever got to this point in the race. It was sort of like they were willing to tolerate all this madness because they kind of agree with him, I think, on a lot of stuff. And they didn't want to upset the far left liberal base, probably the socialist wing of the Democratic Party. That's probably part of it too. But then at some point they realized, oh my God, this might actually happen. And now they're starting to kind of mobilize against him, but they've already normalized him by treating him like he's a legitimate candidate for all of this time. If they had from the very beginning said, no one should take this guy seriously. Look at all the horrible things that he said about communism in the past. I mean, just think about that one thing alone, right? We've known about all of these quotes about Nicaragua and Cuba and all. This has been around for a long time. So why is it that we're only getting press reports about it now? Why didn't this come out a year ago? Why didn't this come out the last time he ran for president? Why is it now that we're starting to see these news stories everywhere? I think it's got to be orchestrated and planned. The guy's been in Washington for decades, and just now they're running national news stories about it. Like, oh yeah, I totally forgot that he was in bed with the Nicaraguan Sandinistas, and oh yeah, he liked Fidel Castro. Totally forgot about that. They're just remembering this now. Like, come on,
honeymooned in the Soviet Union.
Oh yeah, well, that's right. I remember that. I mean, come on, they knew it. Yeah, they knew it. They looked the other way. And now he might actually be the nominee. And they're like, oh my God, we might get 4 more years of Trump. We better say something now to derail this thing before we end up with Donald Trump again.
Now it's too late. You created the monster.
That's right.
So my other kind of main takeaway from the debate is that Bernie Sanders, because again, the focus was more on him this time. Last time it was Bloomberg. But Bernie Sanders refuses to talk about how expensive his plans are. So again, this was kind of brought up in the 60 Minutes interview. They kind of like tried to hold his feet to the fire in that, and he tried to tiptoe around it. Same thing with the debate. In fact, they asked him about how expensive his plans were really early on, and he said, how much time do you have to do the math? And the moderator's like 2 hours. He just like started going on about Medicare for all. But I've got a couple of pieces here. One is from our Heartland's very own Chris Talgo. And so this is a Heartland piece, and it goes through, this is the titled Bernie's Plan to Play for His Plans Doesn't Add Up. And it goes through all the different plans, that proposals that he has, and just puts a grand total on it. A very similar article that I have is from a author from the Manhattan Institute that comes to the same total here. But so let me just kind of list off the programs. Everyone talks about kind of his main ones, which is Medicare for All, which is $35 to $40 trillion, depending on which estimate you want to go by. His climate change stuff, which is like 16.3 trillion. And I know people think about the Green New Deal, but that also included some of these other things that are in there. So we kind of have to separate it out. So then also free college and debt forgiveness, 2.2 trillion, housing guarantee, 2.5 trillion, universal child care, 1.5 trillion, forgiveness of medical debt, $81 billion, job guarantee, which could be upwards of $30 trillion, Social Security expansion, expanding family leave, and there's like 15 other little smaller ones, but it all adds up to $97 trillion over 10 years. $97 trillion over 10 years. So I did some back of the envelope math here, and Justin, pay attention to this because, again, this is just me literally on a scrap of paper before we did this podcast, but I was just thinking about it, right? So in 2019, the government spent $4.45 trillion. So that's on a revenue of $3.46 trillion. So right off the top, we have $1 trillion deficit that also has to be factored into this, right? So we spent 4.5 trillion rounding up, plus another 9.7 trillion if we're going to have all of these Bernie Sanders things in mind. So that equals to $14.2 trillion. I know these are ridiculous numbers, but I'm going to bring it home in a minute here. $14.2 trillion if we had all of Bernie Sanders' plans in place here. The size of the U.S. economy is $21 trillion. So just with federal spending, we're talking about 2/3 of the United States economy would be going through the federal government. So then I started looking up, well, how much is state and local government spending, right? So that is 17% of the GDP goes through state and local, plus the 66% that would now be the federal government. We're up to 83% of the economy would flow through the government at the federal or state and local levels. 83%, 83 cents on every dollar in America would go through the government. That's pretty close to just straight up communism. I mean,
yeah, well,
am I way off here, Justin, or does that seem?
I mean, I'm not surprised at all that this is this is the situation. That sounds about right. I'd have to see the math, I guess, myself to be sure that you got it all right. But I think that based on those numbers, yeah, I mean, it makes sense. Look at his proposals. You don't even need to do back of the envelope math. If you just list out all the things he wants to take over, he wants to take over higher education. He wants to take over the health insurance industry and by default take over the entire healthcare industry. He wants to take over the entire energy industry. He wants to eliminate all fossil fuel jobs and everything related to that and build a whole new industry. He wants to create a system of publicly owned banks. He wants to create a system of a whole new public housing system. He wants all of these different things, universal child care, the list goes on and on and on and on and on. So when you add up all those things, yeah, it makes perfect sense. Another back of the envelope math way of looking at it is instead of just taking that $97 trillion and spending it on these government programs, you could give everybody, every single individual American, not family, individual American, $293,000 over 10 years. So which would you rather have, America? $293,000 each or Bernie's stupid programs? I mean, why would anybody choose it? This is why it's so ridiculous. Like $293,000. That means if you had a family of 5 people, that's like $1.5 million over 10 years.
Right? I would take that.
Like it's insane. It's
like
insane.
If I had to choose.
Yeah, of course, everyone would take that if they
Hold
had
a
to
gun
choose.
to my head. Why don't you?
Yeah, who's going to choose Bernie's stupid universal? Why would I need universal childcare if I had $1.5 million?
That's a good point.
That's way better than Andrew Yang's pitch.
Yeah,
$1,000.
Yeah, screw that. $250,000 each. So after I found out that that percentage that I came up with, 83%, I tried to find a list of like ratios of like government spending to, GDP, just like by country. And so the United States currently is about 38%. Okay. And that actually puts it like pretty low on this list. That I think Denmark and Sweden's like 50, something like that. So again, this plan, and I know that there's a whole lot of moving parts here, and the economy could just tank, and like the GDP would even be worse. So the percentage could theoretically even be worse than this 83%. But that puts us in line with Libya.
83% of the economy in Libya goes to the government. Huh?
Yeah, it's like 86, but it's still right there.
Well, what's the standard of living like in Libya?
I don't know. Probably not great. But
wow.
Even Denmark and Sweden, it was like 50%. And like just the federal alone with all of these plans would be 66.
Yeah, but this is ultimately, because the other piece to this, and we've Donnie and I have talked about this a million times. Nobody else seems interested in talking about it, but this is why modern monetary theory is so important to understand. This is what modern monetary theory is. It's you control the entire economy without actually having to confiscate property. And you do it by just printing money and then putting the money in the areas that you want to put it in. And then if you can just convince enough people that it doesn't matter what the cost is. And notice here that Bernie Sanders, he just released a plan. Donnie, you mentioned that earlier, right? He released his plan for how he's going to spend all of this money, right?
Yeah,
so he releases, how he's going to pay for all these programs. He releases the plan. And even if you add up all that money, it's like half of the cost of everything. So he doesn't even tell you, even in his imagination of how he comes up with all these different ways he's supposedly going to pay for all this, which is nonsense, most of it. Even then, he still doesn't even get, in his imagination, up to 100% of the cost of these things. That's because his senior economic advisor on his campaign, who was previously the chief economic advisor for the Senate Democrats and the senior economic advisor for him when he ran the first time for president, is the leading person in modern monetary theory, Stephanie Kelton, who believes it does not matter how much money you print. All that matters is that you have a system in place where the government can control inflation through price controls and other mandates on the economy. And if you can do that, you can print as much money as you possibly want. And Bernie Sanders has bought into this theory completely, 100%. This is 21st century socialism. This is how it works. It's just you spend the money and you control the economy by spending the money in the ways that you see fit. And everybody else becomes beholden to you because you're the one with all the cash. And that's exactly what Bernie Sanders' plan is. And as this math shows, at minimum, it's more than 60% of the economy is controlled by the government at minimum. And that doesn't include regulations and stuff like that necessarily, right? So the other 15% that remains, if we get it up to the 80-something% you were saying before, that's going to be all heavily regulated. So it's like, it's 100%. I mean, in reality, everything will be controlled by the government. And you might get your little choices here or there in the so-called marketplace where you get to decide which of the 3 candy bars companies still remaining you want to buy from. But that's pretty much it. If you don't get any other options beyond that, that's the Bernie Sanders dream. And if that's not the Bernie Sanders dream, then why doesn't he just then how can you explain his close association with communist Marxist groups throughout his entire career? How can you explain Stephanie Kelton as his senior economic advisor? How can you explain these policies where he has no plan to pay for anything, his support for the $90+ trillion Green New Deal? You can't. The only way to explain it is he wants to take over the entire economy.
Yeah. And that's like the biggest important takeaway in all of this. Socialism rears its ugly head in different manifestations throughout history. You had the Soviet Union, its literal control over the means of production. Fast forward to like the 70s and 80s with Sweden, when they tried to backdoor that idea with wage earners funds and basically transferring privately held companies to a public ownership. And then fast forward to now, and it's totally, I've said it once, I've said it a million times. It's modern monetary theory. That is the way that they're going to try to control the economy. And it's basically just not worrying about how to pay for it. And it's that simple. And that's why I think that they're going to do it. It's because it's the path of least resistance. They don't have to explain why the government controlling all of these things are better. I know that they're doing that with healthcare, but everything else, they just leave it up to, just spending it the way that you want to spend the money.
Well, and even with healthcare, really, the public option is a version of that.
Sure.
The public option is a version of that. You're basically saying, hey, let's create this government health insurance program, and then you pump a bunch of money into it and you make it undercut all the other people in the private sector and you drive everybody else out of business. I mean, that's the public option of, even though Bernie doesn't even want that, that is a version of modern monetary theory.
Yeah. So I think the biggest lie on the debate stage, the biggest lie would be Bloomberg suggesting that he won the latest debate, which again, I can't let that go. It's like the funniest thing in the world. But the other biggest lie on the debate stage, well, no, that would have to be Elizabeth Warren talking about how she was fired for being pregnant. Dang. All right. The third biggest lie on the debate stage, I think, was when Bernie Sanders suggested that every study out there shows that Medicare for all would save money. So we talked about this in length, I think, last episode, where we were showing like the different estimates and how much that there are, certain liberal groups were saying that it was going to be dramatically more. The Rand Corporation being one of them, the Urban Institute being one of them. So this idea that Bernie Sanders can say on stage without flinching that every estimate out there shows that it's going to save money is just patently ridiculous.
Yeah, well, John Maynard Freeman said...
That's true, Andrew. That's very true.
Oh, look at producer extraordinaire pulling up the picture already. Yes,
yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. I listened to the episode last week.
Oh, that was my favorite joke. So what I've got in front of me here is an article from the Partnership for America's Healthcare Future, where they compiled a bunch of studies and expert statements about this idea. So first off, for context, when Bernie Sanders says it's going to save money, he's not talking about saving the government money, okay? He's talking about it saving the entire society money. If you were to group in what government spends and what everybody else spends on an individual basis on healthcare, that supposedly these certain studies that he likes to point to would save us money, okay? So that's the baseline. That is assuming that we're going to raise massive taxes on people, okay? Like that's baseline. Even he wouldn't deny that, okay? So I've got a whole bunch here. So one was just talking about the Urban Institute, suggesting that it'd be more expensive. Their findings suggested that there'd be like $25,000 in new taxes on families every year. Charles Blauhaus on Mercatus said that doubling all currently projected federal income, individual and corporate income tax collections would be insufficient to finance the added federal costs of the plan. There's a couple other here, but I'm just kind of skipping through. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget said that Medicare for All would, quote, require the equivalent of tripling payroll taxes or more than doubling all other taxes. Stephanie Armour from the Wall Street Journal said that 71% of all U.S. households with private insurance today would pay more under Medicare for All when that's all said and told. Let's see. David Cantonese, a Democratic strategist, cautions that Medicare for All would cost people currently on ACA, the Obamacare, Medicaid expansion, more money than they currently pay because this would include raising taxes on families currently covered at no cost under the Affordable Care Act's Medicaid expansion. FTI Consulting says that Medicare for All could have a significant negative impact on the adequacy of the country's healthcare workforce, access to care, and ultimately patient outcomes. Let's see here. He also continues saying reduction in physicians. This is something that we talked about last time, would be felt most in rural communities already experiencing access challenges, shortages of healthcare workers in rural areas, widen existing healthcare disparities and contribute to hospital closures. Reed Abelson from the New York Times warns that some hospitals, especially struggling in rural centers, would close virtually overnight. Others would try to offset their steep cuts by laying off hundreds of thousands of workers and abandoning lower paying services like mental health. And it just kind of goes on and on. There's several here. And like always, everything I talk about will be in the show notes here. But I assume that you were watching at this point, Justin. What was your reaction when he said every study out there suggests that we're going to save money because of this?
It's a pretty standard talking point for him at this point. You nailed it before in understanding that saving money to him means total healthcare spending across the entire system. That's what he means. And it is possible, actually, that it could save money over the entire system. And the reason I say that is because if the government is put in charge of it, then yeah, theoretically, it could be whatever the government says it is. So if the government wakes up tomorrow and says, total healthcare spending is going to be exactly what it is right now for the next 5 years, we don't care what population growth is. We don't care about inflation. We don't care. We're going to stick it right at whatever it is right now for the next 5 years. They could do that. They could cut it by $1 trillion compared to they could do anything they want. That's the whole point. It's not based on any kind of supply or demand or it's just based on whatever the bureaucracy in Washington, D.C. says. And I guess the perfect example of that is the VA healthcare system. So we have a government-run healthcare system in America. It's the VA healthcare system provided to thousands and thousands and thousands of veterans every single day.
Would you say millions of veterans?
I don't know. Probably not every single day, but millions of veterans do use the VA healthcare system, certainly over its lifespan, its existence, and it's got all sorts of problems. If you've ever been to a VA healthcare facility, a lot of them are frankly run down. It's substandard care. It's widely known that that's the case. And when they do patient satisfaction surveys, it shows that people who go to the VA are completely dissatisfied compared to people who go in the private sector. It's an inferior form of healthcare. So the question, but they're controlling costs to some degree. Sure. Why? Because the government's in charge of it and they just decide whatever the reimbursement rate is. They decide whatever people get paid. They decide how much they're going to spend. So yeah, you could theoretically save money as a healthcare system by putting the government in charge. The question is not whether you would save money. The question is whether the quality of care will be completely destroyed as a result of the government being put in charge of it. And no one ever wants to talk about the quality of care. There's just an assumption that things will be exactly the way they are now, except someone else pays the bill.
Lower
when in
cost,
reality,
less value.
Yeah, exactly. You get what you pay for. And the other thing is, if you could improve efficiency in some way, then theoretically you could cut costs while maintaining value. But when has the government proven that it's capable of being more efficient than anything that exists in the private sector? They fail on that regard all the time on things much less complex than the healthcare system. There's literally no reason whatsoever at all, zero reasons that I can think of for why we should believe that the government is capable of managing the healthcare system better than the private sector. And I'm not saying that the private sector is good the way that it works right now. It's been completely manipulated and destroyed and distorted as a result of government action mainly, but also all sorts of other problems as well. We need a completely different system, a much better system. But putting the people in charge of the healthcare system who are already in charge of all these other broken, failing systems makes no sense at all. And that's exactly what Medicare for All is. And by the way, believing politicians who say that they're going to fix the system, they're going to make it better, just put us in charge and we can fix all of these problems, who are at the same time are doing nothing about the VA healthcare system that they're already in charge of, and the same people who promised that if you like your doctor, you can keep it, and that if you pass Obamacare, the average family will save $2,400. Why? I mean, why are you listening to them? I mean, no reason to believe anything that they say at all.
Well, no doubt. And I'm glad that you brought up that idea of like the status quo is not good. We did a whole extended segment last episode about how like this idea that Medicare for All is always put up there as just basically being the only potential solution to the status quo. And that when people on our side are fighting against the Medicare for All, it always just seems like to the average person that we're defaulting into defending the status quo. So I gave Justin 15 minutes to basically lay out what the conservative free market solution is that just basically goes in the opposite direction of what Medicare for All would do and would lead to better health options and more cost savings. So if you're interested in that, we're not going to retread that because we're already kind of running short on time, but go back to our latest episode. There's a lot of good solutions in there, free market solutions to the healthcare troubles that we're in.
So
what
should we, Justin, like obviously the most common reason for implementing, or the reason that people say we need to implement all this stuff is because they argue that healthcare is a human right. So I guess, what do you say to that? Like, what is the most persuasive thing? Because at some point we can talk about, the costs and all of that stuff, but they're trying to take the moral high ground from us. So I guess, what's your response to that?
So I think that there are two responses that I think could potentially work. If you're able to, we got to flesh it out. We need to come up with an alternative plan that's very clear what in conjunction with these two arguments. But the two arguments I would make for it are, number one, even if you believe healthcare is a human right, we can build a system that provides people with healthcare, with access to healthcare. That doesn't mean that the government gives it to everybody, because some people the government doesn't need to give it to. They can afford to pay for it on their own. We can build a system that provides access to healthcare for everyone by making healthcare really affordable. Right now, it's not affordable, making it more affordable, changing the way the health insurance system works, and then providing safety nets for people who truly need them, but build those safety nets on a sliding scale so that it allows people, instead of getting trapped in poverty, to work their way out of poverty while still receiving the medical care that they need. Okay. And introduce free market systems of free market forces into that system so that people aren't just getting some system like that from the government, but that they're actually provided with, say, like an HSA account or something where they can go around and shop for health insurance themselves and work their way out of poverty and work their way into a system where they're completely self-sufficient. So you need to provide an alternative, is what I'm saying, is the first step. Even if you want to provide health insurance to everyone, you think everyone needs to have health care, it's a human right, but we could still fulfill that by creating a better system than the one that's being proposed. That's number one. Number two is, I believe philosophically, it is completely impossible to argue that healthcare is a human right. Because if it is in fact a human right, if that's true, then what it means is that we have to give that to them. Society must give it to them. It's a right. And if we don't give it to them, we're denying them a human right. So we have to give it to them. We're morally obligated to do that. If that's true, then that means that everybody who provides healthcare does not have a right to determine what it is they get in return for their labor, for providing that service to those people. They have no ability to determine what that is because they must provide it to them. Now, if you try to argue that those people should also have the right to determine what their wage is, for instance. So a doctor has a right to say, I will only work for X amount of money to provide this service to this person who must receive that service. They have to get it because it's a human right. And this doctor, they also have that right. Then what that means is, logically, that the rest of society must pay that doctor whatever that doctor or nurse or whatever wants, whatever that person wants. So if it's $1 million a year, we have to give it to them. And because they have to provide that service to this other person, and we can't force them to work for some set wage, because if we're forcing them to work for a set wage, then what's the difference between that and some form of indentured servitude or something, or even slavery? If you're requiring them to work and they don't get to decide how much they get paid, then you're basically a slave of some kind, right? So logically, when you play this all out, healthcare can't be a human right because it denies human rights to other people, other human rights that people definitely have. Unless you believe that all healthcare workers should just work for whatever society decides to pay them. And if they don't like it, then too bad, they still have to do it. Creating thereby an entire class of indentured servants. Unless you believe that, then you can't really believe healthcare is a human right. Or I guess you could believe it is a human right, but we have to pay doctors and hospitals and doctors, and nurses, whatever it is that they want, even if it's some outrageous sum of money. So really, it's logically inconsistent, I guess, is my other argument. That other argument, though, is not very persuasive to a lot of people. Unfortunately.
And that's more than 5 words. that's
it. You need a slogan.
Yes. That's why I started with, you need an alternative plan. You got to have an alternative plan.
But it is cool.
I've got like you're eating your own time here because I got a fracking thing for you.
Oh, that's okay. We don't have to do that. We did
You
that
don't
a few
want to?
weeks ago. I think it's cool that Walmart is offering $30 medical checkups and $25 teeth cleanings.
That is cool.
Okay, great. Did you take advantage of that? All right, we're gonna not do the fracking thing.
No, I didn't.
There was a study that basically showed how detrimental it would be to Pennsylvania. I'll link it in the show notes. And Pennsylvania being one of these kind of battleground, really important states in the election, I wanted Isaac's opinion on how this is going to play against Bernie Sanders, who wants to ban fracking. But instead, we can spend the last 5 minutes.
Where's our proposed bill of the week?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll tell you what the proposed bill of the week was.
Get it.
There was a proposed bill in Illinois, and it died in committee or whatever. It actually died in the General Assembly. But it was basically to have every gas station had to employ somebody that would pump your gas for you if you wanted it. And the reasoning for it was a safety thing for people that didn't feel safe pumping their own gas, apparently. And 2 was a jobs thing, that this was going to spur local economies because all of these, new roles that were going to have to be filled by somebody. So that's what I was going to bring up. I forget exactly the angle that I was going to bring it up with, but it's old news already because it died. But I just thought it was ridiculous. It would have put us as one of 2 states. I think New Jersey has a law like this in place.
Jersey, you can't pump your own gas.
Okay.
It's illegal.
Same with parts of Oregon.
Yeah. It's really weird because I've driven through New Jersey many times going up and down the East Coast. And it's every gas station in New Jersey. You don't pump your own gas. They have a servant, a service person there at every single one, basically pumping your own gas for you. And it is just the weirdest. It's the weirdest thing. And what's really funny is because Isaac mentioned in Oregon, they had, I don't know what the case is in Oregon, but I know that at least in parts of Oregon, they rolled it back at some point recently. Right. And people were freaking out.
I'm looking at that right now.
Yeah, they were freaking out because they're like, they've never pumped gas before in their lives, right? So you're like 50 years old. You've lived in Oregon your whole life, right? You've never pumped your own gas. And so you're like, you don't know what to do. You're scared to death that if you pump your own gas, it's going to spill all over the ground or whatever.
Yeah. Here's a few good ones.
Yeah.
There is a reason we require gas attendants to have a pumping license, which I don't think that ever was the case. Many people don't have the training to use gas pumping machinery, and it will end in unnecessary deaths from explosions. But go ahead. Apparently, money is all people care about, selfish commies. Like, they think everyone's just going to do the Zoolander opening scene.
I was just telling Andy to try to find that clip, but they're spraying gas at each other.
Yeah. That's what they think. That's definitely what they think, without question. It's so weird. It's such a weird thing.
So it's like, I saw this. I actually saw it and wanted to talk about it before. Okay, just play it while I talk. Turn off we're going to get kicked off. Turn the volume up. So like I saw it before it died in committee. But my thought was like, this is Illinois. Like, this could legitimately have a chance at passing, especially for like the reasons that were given. I was genuinely concerned that this could have actually been a bust. For those that are watching on YouTube, he pulled up the Zoolander clip where they're gasoline fight with each other. This is what people thought was going to happen in Oregon when they stuff back.
Yeah, this is and the gas station blew up along with everybody in it. So there it is. Yeah, no, that's definitely. I mean, it is really strange, but it just goes to show you that you can have really, really stupid laws, and people will, if they will just sort of accept them. You know what? They'll just accept them.
Yeah. And here's the little bow on this. Okay. It's the idea that if we were to go in the direction of Medicare for all and put the government in charge of all of that stuff, it will be impossible to reverse that and go backwards into a more of a free market system.
That's a great point. There's this other kind of similar to the gasoline law. There's this law in the town that my parents live in, Rhode Island, where they have a law. It's a law. Every school bus has a second employee on the school bus. Okay, so there's a school bus driver and a second employee. And that second person's only job, literally the only job, is that whenever the bus stops to like let students in or out or whatever, that second person gets off the bus, walks to the back of the bus and checks underneath the bus to make sure there's no kids under the bus. That's the only that's the sole job of this person, because like 15 years ago, some kid got run over by a bus. And ever since then, they now put a second person on every single school bus in the town. And it's been that way forever, even though nothing else has ever happened as at one time. Yeah. And it's there forever.
Yeah, there forever. All right, that's it. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of the In the Tank podcast. Tune in every Friday for a new episode of the show. If you like it, please subscribe, write a review for us on iTunes. We greatly appreciate it. You could also find us on Stitcher, Google Play, SoundCloud, YouTube, if you want to put a face to the voice, pretty much everything nowadays. If you'd like, you can follow us on Twitter at In the Tank Pod. If you have any comments, suggestions, questions, anecdotes, jokes, feel free to email us at inthetankpodcast@gmail.com. Justin, where can the fine people find you?
Well, Donald, they can find me all over the place because I am blowing up this week. Blowing up. Oh. You can find me on Twitter at Justin T. Haskins. You can find me on Facebook at Justin T. Haskins. You can also find me on the Glenn Black radio program earlier this week. You can find me on Fox. Hold on. Wait a second, Isaac. Don't interrupt me.
All right, no, let him
keep going. I think it's very
tonight.
Go ahead.
It's on Tucker Carlson tonight. I think tonight will be the night that finally happens. And next week on Monday, Tucker Carlson Tonight again, I've been told, for a Super Tuesday special. So, yeah, anywhere you want to find me, I'm there.
All right.
Congratulations, man. That's awesome.
And Isaac, where can the fine people find you?
Nowhere. You have to go to the deep reaches of the internet and Twitterverse to find me at The Fracking Guy on Twitter.
He's on
and at AmericanExperiment.org. I am a no one. Justin is everything.
He's on Friendster and MySpace. Check him out.
Exactly.
He's on MySpace. Yep.
All right, that'll do it, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. We'll talk to you next week.